Welcome back, radio entrepreneurs, listeners, and fans. I'm producer Nathan Gobes, filling in for Jeffrey Davis and Jonathan Friedman this morning. Excited to be back with you in the studio, and I'm excited to introduce you to our next guest, James Rolke, Director and CEO of Revelation Biosciences. Welcome, James.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
It's great. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining. Why don't you start by just telling us about Revelation Biosciences overall? We'll get into your background and what the company's up to after that. But start by giving the listeners and viewers an overview of the company, if you don't mind.
Sure. So Revelation Biosciences was founded in May of 2020. We actually started the company at just as the COVID-19 pandemic was starting to get going. But we didn't want to be a COVID-19 specific company, but we wanted to develop products that would have potential as therapies and tools for the pandemic. But we wanted them to be pan-viral in nature, meaning working across multiple virus types. And so we actually started the company on the diagnostic, the Revit kit, which is our universal screening tool that gives you a yes/no answer. It tells you if you have a respiratory viral infection, period, regardless of virus type. So if you have influenza, COVID, or some other virus type, it'll tell you if you have if you're sick or not. In terms of the therapeutics, we set out to develop, again, pan-viral. We have our flagship program. It's known as RevTX99A. And that works as we're developing it as both a prevention and a treatment for respiratory viral infection, regardless of virus type. We also think that the same technology, which led to RevTX99B, would be useful as a treatment for chronic nasal congestion due to allergies and other underlying conditions. And then lastly, an earlier stage program called RevTX200, also based on the same platform technology, is useful as an intranasal adjunct and intramuscular vaccine to produce an overall better immunization. And that one's actually becoming, frankly, very important because it improves the existing intramuscular vaccines. All of the COVID vaccines are intramuscular vaccines. And what happens is when you give an intramuscular vaccination, you get a really strong body response, a systemic response, but you don't get a strong mucosal response, meaning in your nose. And since most viruses enter through the nose, it would be advantageous to have that mucosal protection as well. And RevTX200, when you give it concurrently with an intramuscular vaccine, will give you the best of both worlds and will overall give you better immunization and protection.
Interesting. Well, those are some really exciting products that you guys have, and I definitely have some more questions on those. But before we get into all that, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background. What got you into this? What led you to be leading Revelation Biosciences?
Sure. So my background is I'm actually a chemist, but I've been working in the pharmaceutical field for about 30 years. My experience really spans all areas and phases of drug development, from discovery all the way through to approval and commercialization. Prior to Revelation, I was actually chief scientific officer at La Jolla Pharmaceutical Company, where we brought two life-saving drugs, Giapreza for severe hypertension and artesunate for malaria, from discovery through approval. And so when I left La Jolla, I actually was interested in starting a new company, and COVID-19 occurred. And it's an actually interesting story. We started the company again on the diagnostic, and it was because our chairman, Dr. George Tidmarsh, was having a conversation with one of his colleagues at Stanford, and his colleague was pining on the fact of when did breast cancer surgery become elective, and he was really pining on the fact that there weren't enough tests to allow people to come in to have necessary procedures done, in the medical environment. And so we put our heads together and said, well, gee, there's got to be a better way. We could develop a universal screening tool that just simply allows one to screen themselves. You don't really care what you have, because you don't want to go to visit your grandmother in a nursing home, for example, or go out if you have influenza. Influenza is a very deadly virus as well. And so we wanted to develop a universal screening tool that allowed us to screen large numbers of people very rapidly, and that led to the diagnostic. And I can tell you a little bit more about that later on. So yeah, that's how I got into starting Revelation.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe that would be a good segue to talk more about the diagnostic tool, how it works, and some of the other things you mentioned earlier as well. You know, what stage are each of these at? What stage is the company at overall?
Great question. So the diagnostic, all of our products are actually based on measurement or modulation of what's called the innate immune response. So just very briefly, the innate immune response is our body's natural first line of defense against any type of infection or inflammation. And it works through the upregulation of proteins known as cytokines and chemokines. And so when a pathogen such as a virus enters your nose, it'll interact with receptors in your nose, activating the innate immune response, which ultimately leads to recruitment of what's known as the adaptive immune response. The adaptive immune response is what leads to the production of antibodies. And that's sort of a little bit of a background, just so your listeners understand the context of the
biology
products.
101.
Yes, and so the diagnostic is based on measuring the body's response to an infection. So that's why it's able to detect multiple virus types. So we don't care if you have influenza or if you have COVID or if you have RSV or insert virus name here. What we actually care about is whether or not you're sick. And so the way the test works is you swab the lower portion of your nose, just the nares. You take that sample, you apply it to a sample application pad. It looks very similar to a pregnancy test kit. It's a lateral flow assay device. You apply it to a sample application pad, you wait 15 minutes, and at the end of 15 minutes, you get a visual readout that says, yes, I have an infection, or no, I don't have an infection. And so you can see the utility of that. That would allow people to test themselves on a regular basis, and make informed decisions about whether or not they can go out. Okay, I'm sick today. I probably should stay home and not spread my germs around, or I'm not sick. I can go about my daily business. And again, you don't want to go out if you have the flu any more than you want to go out if you have COVID. And so then and so where we are with that is we are actually, just to wrap up the diagnostic, is we've completed the development work, and we're in the process of doing the final clinical and product evaluation to be able to file for marketing approval, which we plan on doing in the early part of 2023. Just one other thing on the diagnostic. We did some preliminary testing where we collected samples from 190 different subjects. And what we showed in that 190 different subjects is that we had 100% correlation with PCR for COVID, meaning no one with an active replicating SARS-CoV-2 virus was allowed to slip through our test. On the contrary, we actually had a 14% false positive rate, meaning what it says is our test says you're sick, PCR for COVID says you're not, but if you then test those people for additional virus types, what you find out is in fact they are sick. They have either influenza, a rhinovirus, or another coronavirus. And so our kit is actually working the way we had intended it, and when we developed it as a universal screening tool.
That makes sense.
So, and then just going on to the therapeutic products. So same thing, what we set out to do is develop products that stimulate your innate immune response. So it basically creates a biologic shield to infection. And so the way RevTX99 works is the active ingredient is a molecule called FAD. FAD is short for phosphorylated hexacylated disaccharide. That's a mouthful. But the way it works is it stimulates receptors known as toll-like receptor 4 that's widely expressed in your nasal mucosa. So you give it intranasally as drops, and you stimulate the toll-like receptor 4 that activates a particular pathway in the innate immune response that leads to the production of multiple protective cytokines being interferons, interferon-related proteins, and other protective cytokines, and not inflammatory cytokines, which I think people have heard and read about in the news, which, such as IL-6 that lead to bad outcomes. And so we actually conducted a phase 1 clinical study with RevTX99 in healthy volunteers, where we looked at not only the safety, but we also had the opportunity to look at the activity of the drug as measured by cytokine upregulation. And what we showed in that study is in fact, that the drug is very well tolerated from a safety perspective. There were no significant or serious adverse events. Everything was mild. And then the other thing we showed is we showed significant upregulation of key protective cytokines versus placebo. So based on that, we actually have started and actually completed enrollment of a phase 2b virus challenge study. And just so your viewers understand what a virus challenge study is, it's when you have basically healthy volunteers come in and they volunteer to allow us to make them sick. And so what in that particular study, we give RevTX99 prophylactically. So you give the drug prior to inoculation with a virus type, and in this particular case, we're inoculating people with the H3N2 influenza virus. And so we've completed, and so the outcome from that study, I should say, is as you're looking for a reduction in the rate, duration, and severity of the viral infection for those treated with RevTX99 versus those treated with placebo. And again, we have completed that study, and we're actually anticipating the top line results from that study in early Q2 of this year. So we're very excited as a company about that. If the results from that study are positive, then we'll move into those later stage studies, probably an additional phase 2b study to further understand and optimize the dose and dosing regimen, and then move into a phase 3 registrational study to get the drug approved.
Interesting. That's all very exciting and some really groundbreaking stuff. Would love to have you come back at a later date and talk to us about the progress of everything. Before we wrap, I did want to ask as well. On our show, we love to try to impart knowledge upon other business owners and entrepreneurs that may be watching and listening. Everybody knows launching a new business is difficult. Launching during the pandemic, I'm sure doubly so. Do you want to talk about any of the possible trials and tribulations that you've gone through over the past few years to bring it to where it is today?
Sure. So it's also a good question, and I can give you a reasonably good answer. So, when we started the company, we actually started it on at about, we had a $1 million seed round for financing, and you have to stretch and make every dollar count when you're starting a business, right? And so that's really one of the keys. And so with that $1 million, we identified and developed in-house the formulation technology that led to the RevTX99, as well as advanced the diagnostic, which again is where we started the company. And based on the 4 or 5 months worth of work that we did with that $1 million, we were able to then go out and raise an additional amount of money. I think it amounted to about 12 million or roughly dollars. And we used that money to complete the phase 1 clinical study that we had actually originally started with the seed money to lead to that data that I just described. Mm-hmm. And then from there, our ultimate goal was to eventually go public, and we explored a number of avenues, from IPO to reverse merger to merging with a special purpose acquisition company, and we ultimately wound up merging with a SPAC known as Petra Acquisition Incorporation. Mm-hmm. And that occurred late. Well, actually, it occurred early this year. Unfortunately, timing is everything, and I guess that's one of the things you just have to stick to your knitting. So we reverse merged right at the beginning of the year, mm-hmm. and we really couldn't have picked a worse time to become a publicly traded company, because, as I'm sure all of your listeners are patently aware, the stock market in general went down. Yes,
Yeah.
and the biotech market in particular took a massive hit.
Mhm.
Losing greater than 60 to 70% of its value in a lot of companies. So we were not immune to that, even with good data, where we were not immune to it. And
Right.
my advice to everybody is a steady hand on the tiller, as a sailor would say. It's you have to just believe in what you're doing, be creative, and just keep working at it, right, until you get to the next, until you weather the storm and you get to the next value inflection point. And that's what we're doing as a company, is we believe in our products and we're going to continue to work towards them. I'm not keeping them. I don't watch the stock price on a daily basis, because if I did, I would drive myself insane. I just stick to what I
Yeah.
do best, which is
Yeah.
develop products.
Well, great. I think that's great advice for entrepreneurs and business owners at any stage of their business. James Rolke, Director and CEO of Revelation Biosciences. James, if people want to find out more about Revelation Biosciences, about some of the products you guys are working on, things like that, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, it's the best place to go is to go to our website. It's revbiosciences.com. That's REVBIOC, BIOSICEINCES, revbiosciences.com.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all kinds of information on there about the technology that goes into our products, some of the data, as well as our corporate presentation and corporate context.
Great. Well, thank you, James. I really appreciated you joining this morning. And like I said before, hope that you can come back, in maybe 6-12 months, tell us how everything has progressed. And we always love to get updates.
I would love to do that. Hopefully by then we'll have the drug, well through the next clinical study, and have demonstrated the utility of, the products that we're working on, and hopefully they'll be, well on their way to approval.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thanks again, James. This has been Radio Entrepreneurs, and we'll be back with more on Radio Entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Bye.